Bien, je crois que nous pouvons commencer. Bienvenue ici au Collège de France pour la deuxième conférence du professeur Shaughnessy qui portera aujourd'hui donc sur le livre des documents ou shujing en chinois ou shangshu. Nous sommes déjà expliqués la semaine dernière de cette incertitude qui a plané un petit peu sur l'ordre dans lequel les deux premières conférences allaient être données. La semaine dernière, le professeur Shaughnessy a finalement traité du livre du changement ou des mutations, le Yi Jing ou Zhou Yi. Et donc cette semaine sur donc le livre des documents, la semaine prochaine donc sur le livre des odes ou le Shi Jing, et en dernier lieu donc un ouvrage qui n'est pas considéré comme un classique confucéen, en tout cas, le Lao Tzu. Mais toujours du point de vue des textes qui ont été exhumés des tombes, essentiellement, lors des découvertes archéologiques des quelques 40 dernières années. Voilà, donc je donne la parole au professeur Shaughnessy. Merci.
Thank you very much. Last week, I began with several apologies. I'll do that today as well. Last week, I'm afraid I didn't control the time very well. I had far too much to talk about within 1 hour. I will tell you that the materials that I introduced last week in that 1 hour, I was teaching for 4 months to graduate students in Hong Kong. So it was a challenge to try and digest everything into 1 hour. For today's talk, it should not be quite so difficult because there aren't as many materials, newly discovered materials concerning the classic of documents to introduce. The second apology is that I'm afraid that this topic, the classic of documents, will probably be of least interest to the greatest number of people. It's about 20 years ago, I published a book called Before Confucius, Studies in the Creation of the Chinese Classics. And one of the readers, 2 of the chapters in that book concerned documents in the classic of documents. And one of the referees for the press wrote, please don't let Shaughnessy publish anything more about the classic of documents because the rest of us don't share his interest in this book. But it's a tremendously important book for the history of Chinese classicism. And the talk today will be rather different from the talk last week, in which I was really just introducing the great number of discoveries that were made during the 20th century and then even in the first decade of the 21st century concerning the classic of changes. In the case of the classic of documents, the discoveries have only been in the last 5 years. And so I won't get to them until the very end of the talk. But the classic of documents has been of great concern to Chinese classicists for at least 2,000 years. And so I will spend most of the talk talking about the history of the study of the text. And unfortunately, we now have a video recording of this, but there will be very little imagery that will be worth recording. I will show several slides, but they'll have text on them rather than images. But I do want to start with one image, just as I did last week, starting with Professor Chavan. And when we think of the Shangshu and France, of course, we think of Paul Pelliot, who in 1916 published a Dunhuang document the Shangshu Shiwen that was, the Shangshu Shiwen was written about 600 AD. The Dunhuang document, I don't know the date of it actually, but of course this very iconic picture of Pelliot working in the tomb in Dunhuang that I'm sure is quite familiar to all of you. And so the article that he published that used this particular manuscript as an excuse for writing the article was called the Ancient Text Classic of Documents and the Shangshu Shiwen. I thought that being in Paris, it would be appropriate also to show this manuscript, at least as it appears in Pelliot's article. I'm sure there are better photographs of it available now, but except for the first part of the scroll and the last part of the scroll, it's wonderfully well preserved. And what the Shangshu Shiwen was a quasi-commentary, almost like a dictionary explaining characters in the text of the Shangshu. Pelliot wrote a very long article in which he went over the history of the study of the classic of documents. And it remains to this day, almost 100 years after its first publication, as probably the Western study that anyone talking about this text would go back and look at. And that, I think, is quite a testament to the contents and the argument that's adduced in the article, that 100 years later we can still read it with great profit. The Classic of Documents, in the Han Dynasty bibliography, the Yiwen-zhi of the Hanshu, where it talks about the Classic of Documents in a general sense, it says that the origins of the documents is distant indeed, and Confucius is supposed to have edited this text. It's supposed to have started with the time of Yao and Shun and continued down to the time of Confucius. And when it says to Qin, it doesn't mean the Qin dynasty of the 3rd century BC, but rather that the last document in the Classic of Documents is supposed to have been an address made to the ruler of the state of Qin in the 7th century BC. So still well before the time of Confucius. And it's supposed to have had 100 chapters. Confucius is supposed to have selected from all the documents, all of the state documents that were in existence at his time, and selected the 100 most important of them. And that he wrote prefaces to them and put them in an order. The documents no longer exist in 100 chapters. And indeed, when we talk about the documents, just as Professor Pelliot did in the documents in ancient characters, then, of course, if we say in ancient characters, that implies that there's also a documents in modern characters. Or we sometimes call them Old Text and New Text, the Guwen Shangshu and the Jinwen Shangshu. And this is just to give you some sense of the organization of the text as we now find it, or as we have found it since the early 4th century AD. It's divided into ancient text from the mythological period, the Yushu, that goes back to the time of Yao and Shun, putatively the 3rd millennium BC. So there are texts that are supposed to date from about 2200 BC. And in the old text, there are 5 chapters of that. In the new text, there are 2 chapters. And those 2 chapters would coincide. Everything that you find in the new text, you find also in the old text version of this text. The Xia Shu, of course, derives from the Xia dynasty, the first of the 3 historical dynasties of antiquity, the Xia, Shang, and Zhou. And so then you have the Shang Shu, in this case, the different character Shang representing the Shang dynasty, and then the Zhou Shu texts that are supposed to have come from the Zhou dynasty, most of them from the Western Zhou dynasty. And that is the bulk of the text. In both the new text version, so there are either 19 or 20 texts that are attributed to the Zhou period in the new text version, 32 in the old text version. And so that constitutes over half of the entire text. The Shangshu can also be divided by types of chapters into 5 different types of chapters. There are things called mo, that are consultations between the advisors to the ruler and the ruler. So discussions about how they should proceed on matters of state affairs. Instructions, these are what ministers are, when they represent to the ruler what they think the ruler should do. But this is a one-way instruction, whereas the mo is supposed to be a dialogue. The shun is just the minister's representation to the ruler. There are announcements by the king, and these announcements are usually to large numbers of people, addressed to large numbers of people. Declarations, sure, that are battlefield speeches. And then finally, commands, ming, which are enfeoffments on the part of the king to people who are being charged now to rule local states. And he's telling them how they should do that. So whether in the old text or the new text version of the Classic of Documents, each of the chapters, whether 28 or 29 in the new text version or 45 in the old text version, can be divided into one of these 5 types of chapters. And so you get a sense just from these classifications what kind of text these are. They're not the Classic of Changes that we talked about last week. They're not the Classic of Poetry that is obviously poems, but rather these are more or less state documents. In some ways, the Classic of Documents should count as the constitution of Chinese civilization. It's a text that is very frequently cited in writings from the time of Confucius through the 3rd century BC. But even though it's very frequently cited, many of the citations, many of the quotations from it are no longer found in the text. Indeed, in one survey, as I have indicated in red there, only 45 out of 137 different quotations that refer to the Classic of Documents. In this 3 century period from about 500 BC to 250 BC, only 45 of them are found in the current text. Of course, in part, that's because whether in the new text version of the Classic of Documents, 28 chapters, or even in the old text, 45 chapters, is less than 1/2 of what the Classic of Documents was supposed to have originally contained, 100 chapters. So it would sort of make sense that we'd have less than half of the quotations still represented in this survey. But indeed, it's even fewer than half of the quotations are found. And in part, that will be one of the topics that we'll explore today. Why should so few of the quotations be still reflected in the current text? And I apologize for this slide. It will be the last cheesy slide that I inflict on you today. But when you have a PowerPoint, you want to show people something visual. So the burning of the books, and when I Googled this is the image I found for the burning of the books in 213 BC, and of course this is one of the turning points of Chinese civilization, certainly for Chinese intellectual history, that we talk about the first emperor of Qin first burning the books, decreeing that all books that were not of any technical importance. So the Classic of Changes, because it was a divination text, was spared the fires. But certainly the Classic of Documents and the Classic of Poetry were texts that were of either political philosophy or of literature, and therefore of no use to anybody, and they were supposed to have been burned. Of course, there's a long debate as to whether the books really were burned and how effective that burning may have been. And there was supposed to be one copy preserved in the state archive, but then 5 years after the date, or 6 years after the date of the burning of the books, this putative event, the state archives, together with the rest of Shenyang, was burned when, at the end of the Qin dynasty, when Xiang Yu entered Shenyang and burned the city, and it's supposed to have burned for 3 months. So whether the books were lost in 213 BC or 207 or 206 BC, still in the Chinese tradition, these books, particularly the Classic of Documents, were lost at that time. I actually lied to you. There's one more semi-cheesy picture. This is a Song Dynasty rendition of a person named Fu Sheng, who is supposed in the 160s BC to have remembered the Classic of Documents. And the emperor at the time, Han Wendi, sent his high minister to interview Fu Sheng and to try and reconstitute the text of the Classic of Documents. He was a minister, a borsher, during the Qin dynasty. So by the time that Han Wendi sent Zhao Cuo to interview him, he was already supposed to be in his 90s. And also lived in a part of China far to the east, in Shandong. And ordinarily we think of Shandong as speaking a perfectly normal northern Chinese. But then when I was in Beijing just recently, someone was commenting on my own Chinese, and he said, we can't really pinpoint where it is. It sounds like it's a Shandong accent, which certainly means that it's a very hard accent to understand. And the story is that no one could understand Fu Sheng's Chinese, partially because of the Shandong accent partially because he was very old, except his niece or his daughter. And he would recite the text, and then they wrote it down in modern characters, which is to say the characters that were used during the Han Dynasty. And he remembered 28 chapters. And these are the 28 chapters that were then accepted into the Han Dynasty Imperial Library, and which then constituted the main text of the Classic of Documents. From the establishment of the Academy in 135 BC and continuing forward. And these are the new text Classic of Documents. Actually, there are lots of cheesy photographs in this presentation, but just something that it's now so easy to do this by just looking for images. And this is, of course, the Confucian mansion in Qufu in Shandong. So some decades after 160 BC, and we're not sure exactly when, and part of Professor Pelliot's long article was to discuss the contradictory dates for the discovery of the ancient text or the old text chapters of the Classic of Documents. But certainly it took place sometime during the reign of Han Wudi, so from sometime between 140 and 90 BC, probably towards the end of the 2nd century BC, so between 120 and 100 BC. There's a story that Confucius's house was being enlarged, and they knocked a wall down, and within the wall found secreted these texts written in tadpole characters, Kedo. These included, in addition to the 28 chapters that were already known, another 16 chapters. But then, as the story goes, the discovery of this text and its presentation at court coincided with a witchcraft trial at court, and which consumed the emperor's attention. And so the documents written in these tadpole characters were simply deposited into the Imperial Library and never publicized to scholars at Broad. It is supposed to have still, these texts were supposed to have still been in the Imperial Library through the end of the 1st century BC. So Liu Xin, the Imperial librarian, from 6 BC until 23 AD, is supposed to have seen them and gives some representation as to what they were like. But again, they were never published in any sense of that word. Of course, when we talk about ancient Chinese manuscripts, we can't talk about publication, but they weren't circulated to scholars at large. By the end of the Han Dynasty, and then shortly thereafter, there were a couple of attempts actually to publish the Chinese classics, to fix the text of the classics. The first of these was in the period from 175 to 183 AD, that the Xiping Shijing, the stone classics, all of the classics were written on stone, apparently in the calligraphy of the day, and erected outside of Luoyang, where scholars could all come and copy the text. There's an interesting question as to whether it was possible to make rubbings of these stelae, which were inscribed, and numerous pieces of the Xiping Shijing have been discovered over the last 600-700 years, and particularly in the 20th century, numerous pieces have been discovered. But most people think that it was not yet technically possible to produce rubbings from these steles, primarily because of the quality of the paper at the time. That to do a rubbing, you need a good quality paper in order to take the impression. But still, scholars could go to Luoyang and consult the text of the documents there for all to see, publicly exposed. We know, even though this Stone Classics text of the documents survives only in pieces. So even though there are scores of pieces available, this is probably the biggest piece that there is. But even so, we can tell that this text included only the 28 new text chapters of the Classic of Documents. In the 3rd century, there was another, and one of the reasons that the Xiping Stone Classics didn't survive is because, like Xianyang in 207, 206 BC, when it was burned, Luoyang too was destroyed towards the end of the 2nd century AD, and included in that destruction were the Stone Classics. In the 3rd century, during the Wei Dynasty, the Cao Wei Dynasty, and in the 240s, there was an era known as the era of the correct beginnings, the Zhengshi era, where the Wei Dynasty thought that it too was going to create a dynasty that would live for a long time. And one of the attempts that they did in trying to create this new dynasty was to fix once again the literary tradition of China. And part of that was to engrave the text of the classics on stone and erect them outside of the capital. In this case, they were going to do it in 3 different styles: in archaic Chinese characters, in seal script, and in contemporary modern Chinese characters. And you can more or less make out there that the text is in three registers. That on the right. They didn't. Not only did the dynasty not survive for a long time, it survived past 249, the end of the Zhengshi reign era, by only 16 years. The dynasty came to an end, and indeed it was coming to an end already at this period. So as soon as it began to end. The stone classics in 3 different types of characters were never even finished. They did inscribe the text of the Classic of Documents, and they started inscribing the Chunqiu, or the Spring and Autumn Annals, but they never even got to the end of the Spring and Autumn Annals. So the rest of the classics, Classic of Changes, Classic of Poetry, not to mention the 3 ritual classics, were never inscribed at all. But this too was lost, though these would have been in existence from the time that they were inscribed in the 240s through about the early 300s. They were still available outside of Luoyang for people to consult. Indeed, there's some suggestion that the first great archaeological discovery of China, made in 279 AD, and this is the discovery at Jizhong, the Ji tomb in what is today northern Henan province, that produced texts like the Bamboo Annals and the Mutian Zizhuan, the biography of the son of heaven Mu, that it was possible, and these were texts from about 300 BC, written also in tadpole characters in the script of the Warring States period, that it was possible for scholars of that day to transcribe those texts rather quickly, in part because they had available the three scripts, stone classics, to consult and to see what the ancient characters may have looked like. But this classic too, and the capital at Luoyang and the Imperial Library was burned in sometime between 304 and 311 AD, when the Western Jin dynasty was being overthrown, and there was a civil war, and the capital was burned. So once again, the classics were lost. Not just in the Qin dynasty were the classics burned, but then the Imperial Library was lost at the end of the Qin. The Imperial Library was lost yet again at the end of the Han, and yet again at the end of the Western Jin. So the history of Chinese libraries, at least the early history of Chinese libraries, is more of loss than it is of preservation. Sometimes one thinks that the books probably had a better chance of survival outside of the capital than they did in the capital. But the story of the Classic of Documents begins right after the destruction of the capital of Luoyang in 311 AD. And that is sometime within the next 5 years, a person named Meizi is supposed to have presented a text of the Classic of Documents at the imperial court. And it included not only the 28 chapters of the new text Classic of Documents, but also 16 or 17 chapters of the old text Classic of Documents. So those texts that were supposed to have been discovered towards the end of the 2nd century BC, and which were supposed to have been preserved in the Han Library for at least 100 years and maybe longer. So it included 45 chapters, or 45 documents in 58 chapters, okay, the entire text. It also included a preface and a commentary that are attributed to this person named Kong Anguo, who is supposed to have discovered the text in the Han Dynasty. And now we just go to slides that will have text on them for the next 15 slides or so. The court, also interested in consolidating its control, not only political control, but also intellectual control, trying to establish a unified system of thought and to claim the Chinese literary tradition, accepted this new text of the Classic of Documents as authoritative. This was the text that was now recognized as the Classic of Documents. And indeed, in subsequent centuries, by 600 AD, when Lu Deming was composing his Shangshu Shiwen, that was the topic of Professor Pelliot's study, and which the manuscript is in the Bibliothèque Nationale here, also took the 45 chapters of the ancient text classic of documents as its topic, as its text to be commented upon. And at the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, once again, there was a project established by the Imperial court to consolidate control, intellectual control of China, just as it had won political control. And part of that was this project called the Wujing Zhengyi, the correct significance of the 5 classics. And in charge of this project was yet another descendant of Confucius, Kongyingda. And this project took place, so the Tang Dynasty began in 618, 619, and by the 630s, this project began, and it was trying to come up with a correct interpretation of all of the 5 classics. And at the second of the classics was, of course, the classic of documents, and the text that Kongyingda selected was the text that included 45 chapters, or 45 documents. So when I say 58 chapters of 45 documents, it's a little confusing because some of the documents are divided into 2 or even 3 different chapters. But if we talk about 45 documents, it's the best way to describe it. So here by 645 BC or 645 AD, this was the 45 chapter text of the documents was accepted as authoritative. And I'll let Professor Pelliot speak in his own French for all of you, that he says that this was produced by a faker, that this text, authoritative though it was pronounced, was a forgery. And Lu Deming and Kongyingda, the 2 great scholars from 600 and 640 AD, were, even though they accepted it, it still was false. But the history of the Shujing does not stop there. Even though it was well-intentioned, there's a new transformation that takes place in the history of this document. And that, over the last 1,000 years, has been one of the most interesting topics in the study of Chinese intellectual history, certainly classicism. By the Northern Song Dynasty, people were beginning to be suspicious of this text. Someone who's an older contemporary of the great Zhu Xi, the most famous scholar of the Song Dynasty, a man named Wu Yu, began to say that there's something wrong with the ancient text chapters, these 16 or 17 chapters that were not recited by Fu Sheng in his Shandong dialect. And even the great Zhu Xi himself was suspicious of the text, though he taught the entire text to his students, but he said certainly the commentary, the preface and the commentary that are attributed to Kung An Guo, who's supposed to be from the Han Dynasty, he said, you don't have to read that. Told his students that there was no need to read that because he suspected that they were forgeries. Over the next 500 years, we get periodic intimations that people thought that there were problems, real problems with not just the preface and the commentary, but also with the text the old text or the ancient text of the Classic of Documents. And so in the Yuan dynasty, or the very end of the southern Song dynasty, someone named Wang Bo, who writes an essay called Suspicions About the Documents. How can we dare to doubt the classics? But the Qin burning of the books introduced problems in the transmission of the documents, and therefore we have to doubt the documents. We haven't been able to see the complete classics of past kings. And so therefore, the classics must be called into doubt. Remember that this is being written in the 13th century. This is well before the Reformation in the West. And to doubt the classics, I think, is a very modern moment. And it happened in China and would happen again periodically. It's not that I doubt the classics of the past kings, it's just that I doubt Fu Sheng's oral transmission of the classics. So he's doubting the entire text. Other people would turn their doubts in other directions. So that in the Yuan dynasty, Wu Cheng would doubt the text that Meizi is presented to the Eastern Jin court in the 4th century AD. And he says the reason for that is that the new text, Classic of Documents, is very hard to read. But the ancient text, these 16 or 17 chapters that were included in addition to the original 28 chapters, he says they're very easy to read. They have a literary style and they seem to be the work of a single author. And indeed, for many of us who read the Classic of Documents, this is still one of the ways we can tell the difference between the new text and the old text chapters. The new text chapters, it's ironic that the new text chapters are the ones that are hard to understand, and the old text are easy. They're just written in classical Chinese. So he says these ancient script chapters cover thousands of years, but they were the last to appear, and they're perfect. They're complete without omissions or errors in a uniform style. Doesn't this warrant suspicion? It does warrant suspicion. And Benjamin Ellman has written a long study on the controversy between the new text and the old text, or the modern text and ancient text, Classic of Documents. And he talks about Meizi, Meizhuo, and he says that he did a study where he not only talked about this sort of connoisseurship, where we can read and see different literary styles in the writing, but that he also used what we would say would be evidential or scientific methods for demonstrating that these texts were forgeries. Unfortunately, this text by Meizhuo was never circulated. It survived in, and I think I'm not going to. This is some of the evidence that that Meizhuo discussed, and it's a very important discussion because it concerns the nature of human intelligence, whether our intelligence is natural or endowed to us by the Tao, so the Renxin and the Daoxin. And Meizhuo was able to demonstrate that a quotation in the ancient text, Classic of Documents, was pieced together by quotations from two different sources. And this if you're interested in this topic, then Professor Ellman's study that I think was published in Tungbao is a very good study to consult on that. But Meizhuo's text was never published. A single copy of it survived in the Tianyige Library in Ningbo. It wasn't discovered until the Siku Trenshu project in the 1770s and 1780s. So almost nobody knew anything about it. In the meantime, other people were turning their attention to the same topic that Meizhuo discussed in his Xiangshu Kaoyi. And the most famous of them, early in the Qing dynasty, is a scholar named Yan Ruoqu. And he wrote a book called the Shangshu Guwen Shuzheng. And this term Shuzheng really begins with Yan Ruoqu, and what it means is an attempt to demonstrate where forgers derived their information for creating a forgery. And in the 300 years since the time that Yan Ruoqu was writing, right around 1700, it's become a very important genre of scholarship in China to write these shuzheng, where people get their evidence. So it's a demonstration of the evidence that writers use in composing their text. And Yan Ruoqu was not content with simply saying that the ancient text chapters, these 16 or 17 chapters that were not recited by Fusheng, have a different literary feel than those that Fusheng used, that he recited. He wanted to demonstrate that they had to have been forged by someone after the fact, after the Han Dynasty. And he came up with 128 different items that, to his mind, demonstrate that these had to be forgeries. And of course, I can't today go through 128 different items for you. One, for instance, this only pertains to the Kong'anguo commentary, but he mentions a place called Jinchang. But we know that this city was not established until the reign of Han Zhaodi, which is after the reign of Han Wudi and after the time that Kong'anguo was supposed to have died. So there's no way that Kong'anguo could have referred to this city in his own commentary. So the kinds of evidence that Yan Ruoqu adduced in demonstrating the spurious nature of the ancient text chapters and certainly of the commentary, the Kong'anguo commentary and preface, were of this nature. Things that couldn't have taken place prior to the 1st century BC. So this too was not immediately published, but it was published by Yan Ruoqu's son in 1745. And when it was published, the publication coincided with yet another book by a scholar slightly younger than Yan Ruoqu. Getting ahead of the story here. Another one of these moments of doubting the classics. And this is worth reading. Yan Ruoqu writing about 1700. So the doubts about the tradition, what classics, what histories, what commentaries. My concern is only with what is true. If the classic is true and the history and commentary false, it's permissible to use the classic to correct the history and commentary. But if the history and commentary are true and the classic false, then it's permissible to use the history and commentary to correct the classic. Imagine that in a biblical context, that if we find out that the Bible is false, does that then give us the authority to correct the Bible? Well, of course, here we would say yes, but if we were in many other venues in the Western world, people would be very upset at the thought of correcting the Bible. And the classics in China have very much the same status. And so the notion that a public intellectual such as Yan Ruoqiu could announce that he feels that he has the authority to correct the classics is a very audacious claim. So I wanted to get ahead to the next generation. A younger semi-contemporary of Yan Ruoqiu named Hui Dong produced a very similar kind of study. It was independently produced because he had never seen Yan Ruoqiu's manuscript copy, because the Guwen Shang Shu Kao was actually published in 1740, 5 years before Yan Ruoqiu's study was published. But it's of the same nature. Hundreds of points of evidence demonstrating that the ancient text chapters are forgeries. And by the 19th century, Sun Xingyan, one of the really great scholars of Chinese literary history, wrote another study where he's differentiating between the Jinwen chapters and the Guwen chapters. That is to say, the modern text chapters and the ancient text chapters. And he too demonstrates beyond much question that the ancient text chapters are forgeries, that they were produced in the 4th century AD and produced by way of cutting and pasting from quotations, from ancient quotations, and then filling them out with pretty sounding philosophy. It was almost persuasive to everybody. But right at the same time that Sun Xingyan was producing this sort of final proof that the ancient text chapters were forgeries, there was another great project that the Qing court had set about, and Ran Yuan, who was the head tutor to the emperor, was the editor-in-chief of what's known as the 13 Classics, the Shisanjing Zhushu, the text that we still use today as the authoritative text of the Chinese classics. Whenever we want to cite the Chinese classics, we would go to this. And Ran Yuan included all 45 chapters of the Classic of Documents, which is to say the ancient text as well as the modern text. And then we have, at the beginning of the 20th century, someone who says that Yan Ruoqiu has deluded all of Chinese intellectuals into thinking that our literary tradition is false. So he says that Kang Youwei has come out to say that the 6 classics are all forged by Liu Xin. That's a silly idea that Kang Youwei had. But then the following sentence, I think, is really quite interesting. He says that this kind of silly statement by Kang Youwei is a result of Yan Ruoqiu's delusions and deceptions, that someone has come out and challenged our classics. So it hasn't been shared by all Chinese scholars that the ancient text classics were forged. And now, I thought that I would not use up my time, but I already have. But I will get to the end of the talk in just a minute. a wonderful scholar who passed away 8 years ago, Zhang Zhenglang, was one of the chief editors of the Ma Wangdui manuscripts in the 1970s. And he was frequently quoted as saying that what he wanted to see before he died was a text of the classic of documents. That if only they could, he said, all of these other classics, the classic of changes, the Lao Tzu, even the classic of poetry, all of that is well and good, but what I want is a classic of documents, because he wanted to see whether the classic of documents would contain the ancient text chapters. Unfortunately, Zhang Zhenglang passed away in 2005. In 2007, a corpus of manuscripts surfaced in Hong Kong and began to circulate among the antique dealers and people there who would be willing to invest a great sum of money, because this is far larger than any other corpus of ancient manuscripts that has been discovered to date. Something like 2,300 bamboo strips. By 2000, actually I think it was 2006 that they first surfaced in Hong Kong. In 2008, they were bought by someone who remains anonymous and then donated to his alma mater, Tsinghua University in Beijing. And then Tsinghua University organized a team of scholars to edit these materials, these bamboo strip materials. The leader of the team is, I don't have a pointer, but it's the man who is pointing there, Li Xueqin. Li Xueqin, who next week I think is celebrating his 80th birthday, and who is certainly the greatest scholar of the Chinese classical tradition of our generation, is in charge of this. And included among these manuscripts, and the manuscripts, as I say, there are 2,300 bamboo strips, and they're of all different sorts. But in the very first volume that was published were several chapters of the classic of documents, or of the Yizhoushu. The Yizhoushu is supposed to be the documents that were left out of Confucius's original editing of 100 chapters. And so there were 5 different chapters, one of which, the Yingao, is an ancient text classic. So it's not the complete text of the classic of documents, but it does include both the Jinteng chapter, which is from the current text, the new text classic of documents, and the Yingao, which is a text found in the ancient text classic of documents. And the Huangmen and the Jiagong are both from the Yizhoushu, or the leftover documents. Li Xueqin gave a talk, and it would have been far better if we could have invited Li Xueqin to be here today to give this talk rather than for me to give it. But he's no longer traveling outside of China. He gave this talk in Beijing a year and a half ago, where he talked about the significance of the Tsinghua manuscripts for this controversy about the classic of documents. And he took up 5 questions: whether or not there was a shangshu, an elevated documents in antiquity, whether the archaic text shangshu is authentic or not, the question that I've been consumed with today, whether there was a distinction between the shangshu proper and the leftover documents, that is the current Yizhoushu, whether there was only a single version of the shangshu, and whether the Yizhoushu derived from Han Dynasty editors. And he gave definitive, I think, answers to these 5 questions. And in closing, perhaps the best I can do is simply to report to you what Li Xueqin's answers to these questions. That yes, there was a Shangshu in antiquity, but it wasn't the Shangshu of Confucius, of 100 chapters that we can put names to, but rather the elevated text, ancient text, were regarded as some sort of a coherent corpus and that were available for quotation. So that people identified these ancient texts as something that deserved to be elevated. Whether the archaic text is authentic or not, and this had become a topic again since 1993 when the Guodian texts were discovered, the Guodian manuscripts, and included quotations from the ancient text classic of documents. And some people said this proves that the ancient texts are also authentic. They're not. They're forgeries. The Qinghua manuscripts, I think, prove beyond a doubt that the ancient texts are in fact forgeries. Because this one text, the Yin Gao, that is an ancient text chapter, and we have the Yin Gao in the, called the Xianyou Yide, in the ancient text. There's nothing in common between them except for one or two quotations that are found in other texts. And so we can see how the forger worked. He selected quotations from other texts and used that as the kernel, the seed for producing a full-fledged, perfect text. But it has nothing to do with the ancient, with the real text of the Yin Gao. Whether there was a distinction between the Shangshu and the Yizhoushu, no distinction whatsoever. That they were all documents. So we now think of the Yizhoushu as leftover documents that Confucius decided weren't valuable enough to be included within the text. But in antiquity, it seems that all of these documents were available for quotation indiscriminately, so that the Jiagong chapter is every bit as valuable, or was regarded by 300 BC as every bit as valuable as the Jintang chapter. Whether there was only a single version of the Shangshu? No, of course. What we find from manuscripts is that the manuscripts differ one from another. And the Jintang in particular is this one of the chapters that has attracted the greatest attention from readers in the West, because I think it was Henri Maspero who described it as the first short story in the Chinese tradition. But the Qinghua manuscript of the Jintang is identifiably the Jintang chapter, the metal-bound coffer, but it's very different from the text that's found in the received classic of documents. And then whether the Yizhoushu derived from Han Dynasty editors, Li Xueqin's response to that is yes, this was not a text that was identified in the 300 BC, but rather was produced by the Han editors. Indeed, what we find is that the Han editors were responsible for most of what we have as the ancient literary tradition. So it's not just that they produced the Yizhoushu. In many regards, they produced the Shangshu as well. So the Qinghua manuscripts have now been published in 3 volumes. And they've just made the slightest dent in the 2,300 bamboo strips that they have. They project that the publications will continue over the next 20 years, 1 volume per year. But Li Xueqin was obviously, like Zhang Zhenglong, most taken with this question of the authenticity of the ancient text classic of documents. And so he made a special point of putting those 5 chapters in volume 1, that was published in 2011, I believe it was. So it's readily available. It's a beautiful publication, not even terribly expensive. And so what I would urge anyone who has interest in this question is to avail yourselves of a copy of Volume 1 of the Tsinghua manuscripts and to do your own research on this. And I think you'll find that Li Xueqin's conclusions are persuasive. So with that, I've used up my time, and that, as far as I know, is the current state of the study of the Classic of Documents. Thank you very much.
Bien, vraiment un très grand merci au professeur Shaughnessy de nous avoir guidés en l'espace d'une heure à travers le maquis, alors extrêmement touffu justement de cette histoire textuelle du Shangshu. Il s'est beaucoup excusé du fait que c'est probablement le classique, si vous me permettez, le moins sexy de toute la série, mais qui a curieusement joué un très grand rôle donc, dans la tradition intellectuelle chinoise. Alors, nous n'avons pas le temps de prendre des questions après la conférence, mais il y aura donc une séance un petit peu atelier, séminaire, où vous pourrez venir poser vos questions au professeur Shaughnessy. Donc, jeudi prochain, donc le 20 juin, donc jeudi prochain, il y aura bien une troisième conférence donc portant sur le shading, donc sur le livre des odes ou de la poésie, le matin à 11h, même lieu. Et l'après-midi, donc ce séminaire destiné aux étudiants et chercheurs qui se déroulera donc sur le site Cardinal Lemoine, au 52 rue du Cardinal Lemoine, qui est un autre site du Collège de France, où se trouvent donc les bibliothèques orientalistes. Donc à partir de 14h30 en salle Lévi-Strauss, c'est une des salles du rez-de-chaussée donc du site Cardinal Lemoine. Vous êtes tous les bienvenus pour vous joindre donc à ce séminaire. Et d'autre part, si vous voulez connaître un petit peu la suite de l'histoire du Shangshu, comme je l'ai mentionné déjà la semaine dernière, nous pourrons nous retrouver donc à la soutenance de No Jae-hoon qui est ici et qui a fait un travail tout à fait considérable sur une lecture critique coréenne donc de ce même livre des documents. La soutenance aura lieu donc le 25 juin à l'INALCO, donc dans les salons du 2 rue de Lille à partir de 14h. Voilà. Merci encore et donc à la semaine prochaine, nous espérons. Merci.